Hello and a very warm welcome to our latest Euronews virtual debate. My name is Damon Embling. I'm a journalist with Euronews and I got the great pleasure of hosting and moderating this session for the next 60 minutes or so. It's great to have your company. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world today. So what are we talking about today for the next 60 minutes? Well, we're focusing on this big question. When disaster strikes, how do you respond and reconstruct? Of course, disasters can take various different forms and happen in various different parts of the world, but more often than not, their consequences can be catastrophic, having devastating impacts on communities, people, businesses, everyday lives. We're going to be asking that question on a global basis today, but we're also going to be focusing in on Japan, where you may recall back in 2011, there was a big earthquake and tsunami there, which badly affected the Fukushima area of Japan. It also affected the nuclear power station there. And more than a decade on to this day, the response and the recovery efforts are continuing. So what's happening there today? What are some of the challenges that are being faced in Japan in the Fukushima area? And what are some of the lessons that can be learned by other countries going forward? We're also going to be looking at future risks of disasters happening around the world. What are the risks going forward, particularly linked to things like climate change? And how can those risks be mitigated? And also, when disasters happen, how can the impacts be reduced and limited as much as possible? We've got a great panel of guests joining us for this debate today. Without further ado, let's introduce them. First of all, I'd like to go over to Japan and say hi to Daiichi Takahashi, who's the managing director of an organization called Eat and Energize the East. He's also the president of the NOMA Lab. Good afternoon, good evening to you in Japan, Daiichi.
Hello from Fukushima, actually.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We're looking forward to your contributions today. Joining us from the United Kingdom, where I'm also today, in London is Joanna Walker, who's a professor of earthquake geology and disaster risk reduction at the University College London Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. It's good morning to you, Joanna.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever people are.
Indeed, we have everybody from right around the world today. In the US, we've got Mario Flores, who's got up very early today because it's horrible o'clock there at the moment, very early in the morning. He's the Director of Field Operations for Disaster Risk Reduction and Response for Habitat for Humanity International. Good morning to you, Mario.
Good morning, good afternoon. Hello to all. Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you there, Mario. Thank you very much indeed again for joining us. And last but not least, also in Japan today, we've got Noboru Takamura, who's a professor at the University of Nagasaki. He has a specialism in radiation medicine, and he's also the director of the Great East Japan Earthquake and Nuclear Disaster Memorial Museum in Fukushima. Good evening to you, Noboru.
Good evening and hello.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, to you in our audience, if you have any questions for any of the panelists as we go on through this debate in the next 60 minutes, do join in the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. All you have to do is drop your questions in the chat box just below the video screen where you're watching. And we've got 5 or 10 minutes lined up at the end of this session today to ask your questions to our panelists. So please do get involved. We'd love to hear from you. So let's get stuck into this conversation. When disaster strikes, how do you respond and reconstruct? Mario Flores, I'd like to go over to you, first of all, in the US at Habitat for Humanity International. Now, you're an organization that works on the ground right around the world, going in when disasters strike. A bit of a big question, first of all, but also to help us set the context. What's your experiences of the disasters that you've dealt with as an organization in terms of the varying impacts that they can have?
Yeah, thank you. Impacts are very, dire on particularly the vulnerable population. People who are mostly exposed to natural hazards are the ones that actually receive the brunt of the impact of the disaster. And impacts are all over the place. The loss of housing, loss of shelter, damages to the built environment in general, disruption to the economy, disruption to markets. So it's the actual definition of a disaster. It's a total disruption of business as usual, and it brings a lot of losses, human losses, personal injury, and economical losses too. So the impact is beyond doubt. I mean, we have to really put ourselves in front of disasters that are increasing, both in number and intensity, because of climate change at the moment. So I have seen it first experience in the aftermath. A lot of chaos, a lot of disruption, people looking everywhere, for support, and that's where we need to be able to provide, life-saving and also strategies, to rebuild in a better way, to actually build back safer or build back better, and improve the condition that existed before a disaster strike.
Building back better is obviously one of the big topics that we're going to be talking about today and focusing on in terms of lessons being learned and mitigating the risk going forward. Just give us a tangible example, Mario, if you will, of one of the disasters that you've dealt with that was particularly challenging and the impacts that it had.
Well, I can recall the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, for example. I mean, in the blink of an eye, more than 200,000 people died because of the earthquake. It was one of the most dire situations that I have seen. A lot of people trapped under the rubble, a lot of search and rescue operations that were needed immediately to save people. And also because of the context in which the disaster occurred, because, the country itself in Haiti was not prepared, to deal with such a situation. So they had a really difficult time. And that is something that I want to bring to the discussion here. The context, the social, economic context in which a disaster takes place, it's very determinant on how the response is also gonna play out. So it's not the same to have an earthquake, in a place where there are working rules and building codes, and the built environment is put together according to certain rules, to have the same situation in a country where there is no real effective governance, to make sure that everything that is being built, for example, is according to code. So you see the results, when the natural hazard interacts with these conditions on the ground, the result, it's a major disaster if you don't have that element of prevention and mitigation in place.
Okay, Mario, thanks very much indeed for now. Let's go over to Joanna at University College London. Now, Joanna, you're an expert in seismology, an earthquake expert. Would you go along with what Mario is saying there? And where do you think some of the biggest risks lie going forward with earthquakes in particular?
Yes, I absolutely agree about the context and the most vulnerable people being affected. And later maybe to talk about that in terms of reconstruction as well. I mean, in terms of the highest risks around the world, you have the highest hazard risks where we have subduction zones, so where an ocean plate meets a continental plate. So these are probably the places where you've heard of the largest earthquakes: Japan, Alaska, Chile, and around the world where we see those. But in terms of risk, it's going to be aligned to the magnitude of the earthquake, but it's also going to be where are the poorest communities, the least resilient communities, but also where there's a lack of historical record. So in somewhere like Japan, as we know, there was the 2011 earthquake that we've mentioned, there is a history of earthquake and tsunami, and there's a culture of preparedness. There are some things that aren't perfect, but there's certainly a lot of work that goes into that. And people in the country know that there's a very high risk. But there are areas around the world where you still have that very large risk, but maybe not a historical memory or historical record of it. And where you have that, people may be less prepared. So the actual risk may be disproportional to the hazard because of that lack of awareness and the lack of building codes, either through not having them or through them not being enforced, as Mario mentioned there.
Okay, Joanna, thank you. Daiichi Takahashi, I'd like to go over to you in Japan. Joanna and both I also commented at the beginning about the big earthquake and tsunami that happened obviously in Japan in 2011, which also badly affected the nuclear power station there. You're going to be talking today a little bit later on in this debate about how you're working with businesses to revitalize the economy and businesses in the Fukushima area in the wake of that disaster, the recovery still continuing there. But first of all, before we get to that, can you take us back to 2011 when that earthquake and tsunami happened, when you first heard about it and you understood the scale of devastation, the impact of it? What was going through your mind and how did you want to help? Because you left your job, didn't you, at the time, to help?
Yeah. I was a consultant, a strategy consultant at that time. The first thing that came to my mind when I saw the nuclear power station explode was that this is and this will be the biggest disaster in my life I will encounter. So I have no hesitation. I had no choice but to quit and go right to the region with my backpack, and I started to help distribute the emergency materials.
And what was the scene of devastation there? Just bring this to life for our audience that's watching today, because it has been more than 10 years now. What was the impact in Fukushima, and what is some of the impact still being felt today?
Yeah, in terms of the actual damage, 16,000 people died and 2,500 missing, plus additional 40,000, more than 40,000 related deaths, meaning deaths due to the stress or accident during the evacuation period. And 160,000 people had to evacuate their local towns. And in terms of the agriculture and fishery industry, more than 20,000 hectares farmland was swamped by tsunami, and 300 fishing ports and more than 30,000 fishing boats were destroyed by tsunami. However, it wasn't just physical damage, it was also psychological damage due to the power station explosion. So we had to not just rebuild infrastructure, ports and farmlands, but also we had to regain psychological trust on the part of consumers on the safety of the food products from that region.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that a bit later on, building confidence around those sorts of issues. Daiichi, thank you very much indeed for now. I'd like to go over to Professor Noboru Takamura from the University of Nagasaki in Japan. So Noboru, in 2011, there was this big tsunami, the earthquake, which also impacted the nuclear power station there. This was quite a unique set of circumstances, wasn't it? What kind of unique challenges did this present for Japan in terms of trying to recover from such a big disaster?
Yeah, as you pointed out, so the Fukushima experienced the earthquake, tsunami, and a nuclear disaster. This is the experience that only Fukushima experienced. So especially during a nuclear disaster, most important countermeasures is to minimize the exposure doses in resident, including the external radiation exposure and internal radiation exposure. To minimize the external radiation exposure, the most important countermeasure is to evacuate as soon as possible. Actually, at the time of the accident, so Japanese government issued the evacuation order to the resident within 20 kilometers from the nuclear power station. And then also to minimize the internal radiation exposure, the most important, most effective countermeasure is to implement the food regulation. So that's why just after the accident, the government initiated the food regulation policy so that the resident cannot consume the contaminated foods by radionuclides, especially radioiodine.
Now, in terms of the nuclear power station itself, more than a decade on, the decommissioning process is still happening there, of course, after this tsunami, earthquake, and the impact on the nuclear power station. How complex is that decommissioning process now of the power station, and what's the sort of priorities that are happening at the moment?
As you see that there are 4 reactors, 4 units are completely damaged. So such kind of the decommission process is ongoing simultaneously to 4 reactors. So the most important but difficult strategy is to remove the debris, radionuclides, located in each plant. So for the smooth implementation, such kind of the removing the debris, so the development of the robot technology is essential. So such kind of the technological development is essential strategy for the smooth implementation of decommissioning in Fukushima.
And one of the big challenges right now for the Fukushima nuclear power station is the pressing need to urgently discharge its water tanks as part of the decommissioning process and the wider reconstruction of Fukushima. This issue is something that we've concentrated on in a recent Euronews program that we filmed in Japan. Let's take a look at this clip to understand what it is about this discharge of water that's so important.
We're in Fukushima. 11 years after the region's nuclear disaster, inhabitants are mobilising for its reconstruction. As for the authorities, they're facing the challenge of water. The discharge into the sea of treated water is planned for next year. Water that touched the fuel has become radioactive. Filtered in this plant within the power plant, it's kept in these tanks that'll reach their maximum capacity in 2023. The water's decontaminated of all radioactive substances except tritium, which is inseparable from water.
The treated water will be mixed with seawater to be diluted. Then it will be discharged into the sea, a kilometre away via a tunnel.
Tritium is a weakly, dangerous radioactive element, according to this French scientist.
The characteristics of tritium that will be released at Fukushima are similar to those released by nuclear power plants around the world.
It's information that's not escaped the attention of the fishermen of Fukushima, who are the first concerned by the quality of the seawater.
There's a very small chance that there will be health impacts, but what worries us the most is the negative reputation this creates. In terms of the explanations that we've had from the government over the last 10 years, their explanations have not been false, so we appreciate their efforts.
Professor Takamura, let's just reflect on what we heard in that video clip there. We heard from the French scientist and also the fishing organization about this tritium element remaining in the treated water that's set to be discharged into the ocean. Of course, some people will have concerns about that, including the fishing organization. What would you say about how much worry there should be around tritium and the discharge of this water?
Yeah, as he pointed out, so the tritium is one of the radionuclides which release the very weak radiation, let's say the beta ray. So after diluting the appropriate concentration, so tritium is discharged to the ocean in worldwide, including the European countries. So of course, Japanese government outlined the regulation value, regulation concentration for the discharge of tritium, and then according to regulation, so tritium is diluted by the seawater and is going to be discharged into the ocean. Of course, so currently, many residents of Fukushima Prefecture is getting understanding what is tritium, what is the risk of the tritium discharge of tritium. But the problem is that many Japanese still do not have enough information about the tritium. That may cause a kind of the rumors to the fishery products in Fukushima. That's why the education or the risk communication about such a treated water is getting very important in Japan, not only the worldwide, but also especially in Japan.
Okay, Professor Takamura, thank you very much indeed for that. We also spoke to another European professor some time ago in a previous Euronews program about tritium, and this was the comment from that other professor as well.
Yeah.
Tritium does not accumulate in the human body because it has a very short half-life. You take it up and then you excrete it again, and so it stays in your body for a short period of time, and tritium generally is the least of the problems.
We also asked Professor Steinhauser before about the characteristics of the Fukushima disaster, and he said that it was without common measure to a disaster like Chernobyl.
Yeah, of course.
Chernobyl, for example, has released a huge amount of plutonium and americium and all those very long-lived radioactive substances. So they have half-lives of more than 20,000 years. So basically, for the human timescale, you can say Chernobyl will be contaminated forever. Fukushima is a completely different story because Fukushima has released only tiny amounts of plutonium, actually negligible. You can ignore them. What Fukushima released is basically radioactive cesium. The cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years.
Professor Takamura, would you go along with what you heard there? And you talked about education a couple of minutes ago. What do you think some of the priorities have to be in terms of education around all of this? Because it is a very sensitive issue.
Yeah, of course. But kind of the basic such kind of knowledge about the radiation exposure and the health is very important. So you see that the radiation has a lot of the data and the units such as becquerel, sievert, and so on, so on. So that's why it is very difficult for the general population to understand the meaning of data. So that's why for the experts, it is very important to explain such a meaning of the data. What means the 1 millisievert? What means 100 becquerel per kilogram? Something like a kind of the explanation is very important, I think.
Okay, Professor Takamura, thank you very much indeed for joining us there. Now, if you're in our audience and you're just joining us, the question we're asking today is, when disaster strikes, how do you respond and reconstruct? If you have any questions for any of our panelists that you can see on the screen here today, do get involved in the conversation. Leave your questions in the chat box just below the video screen where you're watching, and we'll have 5 or 10 minutes at the end of this session today to get your questions to our panelists, so please do get involved. Mario Flores, I'd like to go back to you in the US at Habitat for Humanity International. Clearly, there are lots of challenges going on with the impact of the earthquake, tsunami, and the nuclear accident in Japan more than a decade later. I know that Habitat for Humanity International was involved in the initial response to what happened in Fukushima back then. You know, what were you focused on, and what were some of the challenges coming out of it for you?
Yeah, well, Habitat for Humanity in Japan, is an organization that was mostly focused on sending volunteers to other countries to work in our housing projects in support of vulnerable communities. But when the disasters actually came to Japan, they say we have to do something about it. So it was mostly a response that was conducted by a group of volunteers in Japan. In the first phase, it consisted of distributing what we call non-food items, which were, just things to help people who were becoming displaced because of the earthquake and tsunami. And later, when the time came to start thinking about reconstruction, the volunteers also helped a lot with rubble removal. Everything that the tsunami left behind in terms of debris and all of that, volunteer teams from Habitat for Humanity helped to clean up entire communities. So the place would be ready for new construction again or for repairs. And then finally, these volunteers also engaged in repairing, minor repairs, in some of the homes that had been affected by the tsunami. So that was the involvement of Habitat. It's remarkable because it was an organization that was not focused on response in Japan. It was actually focused on doing some fundraising and support to other countries, in Asia particularly. But in this case, they were able to pivot very quickly, make use of their volunteer base to actually help in the Fukushima, in the prefecture where the tsunami took place. I just want to make a reflection, as we're speaking of how we respond. But if we take 2 steps back too, it's also, the issue of mitigation, the issue of preparedness, the issue of managing the risk, and that is something that we have to go back in the case of the earthquake and tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster in Japan, because it was the ripple effect of an earthquake. The earthquake created the tsunami, and the tsunami created the nuclear disaster. So we can see the sequence, the ripple effects of the disasters in this. But then we have to take 2 steps back and ask ourselves, what kind of exposure the nuclear plant had, by being built where it was built, very close to the ocean. I know that the plant has some seawall, that try to prevent, some of the potential tsunamis, but it was never built, to sustain the height of the wave that was generated by the earthquake. And that was actually the cause of the nuclear disaster, the flooding of the area where the generators, the emergency generators, were operating. So it begs the question, because those are risk drivers, how we build the environment, how we decide that, okay, this is a place where we are going to have a nuclear facility. It's close to the ocean. Are we taking all the provisions? Are we taking all the measures, to address the risk that is there just by putting that? Just want to call the attention to the risk drivers that we humans create, because that is where we can make a big of a difference, in preventing future disasters.
And I think the future of nuclear power is a big topic being discussed around the world as we look at the future of energy and how different countries generate that in the future. Professor Takamura, would you have anything to say there to Mario about the sort of future of nuclear power and plants and the risks that might go with that in Japan and right around the world?
This is very good, difficult questions. So after a nuclear disaster, you see that in Japan, almost all nuclear power stations stopped operation. Then after such a passing the new guideline, the several nuclear power stations restarted the operation. But for the future energy balance, the careful discussions of all stakeholders are very, very important, because you see that the future such kind of the best mix of the energy is a very, very important issue for each country. Especially in Japan, we have not so enough natural resources for such country. So we should carefully discuss the future such a direction on the energy balance for our sustainable development, I think.
Okay, Professor Takamura, thank you very much. Joanna, I'd like to go back to you in London at University College London, earthquake expert. I just want to reflect a little bit more on the response to disasters. Obviously, the mitigation of the risks is a very important topic. We'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes as well. But in terms of the response to disasters, earthquakes among them right around the world, often sort of international aid pours in, and lots of help comes in the immediate aftermath. But how important is it also, from your experience, that local communities, local businesses, local organizations, they sort of stand on their own 2 feet. They feel empowered to kind of build back themselves and to take control of their future?
It's a really important point, and it really varies where you are in the world in terms of how people see their own responsibility, what's there in legislation, and what's there in sort of a social contract, which might not be in law, but what is there sort of the contract informally between the government and the people. So if people see it very much as a government responsibility, that can actually discourage people to take their own mitigation measures. That can discourage people from planning, from mitigating at a personal level. So we mentioned earlier about seawalls being built, and obviously when it comes to something like a nuclear power station, that can't be an individual resident responsibility. That very much has to come from the state and from private organizations. But in terms of personal responsibility or community responsibility, that's something that if you can take ownership of, you can encourage much more safety-seeking behavior. Now, there are examples in Japan where a community actually experienced a tsunami in 1960 and wanted to fund themselves a seawall to protect them. And the seawall in the past provided protection. So they put in a lot of money to actually reinforce the seawall and they had an inner layer and an outer layer. But unfortunately, that can work both ways, because it's great in providing protection up to a certain level. But in this case, the seawall wasn't high enough to protect them, because this really was an extreme event. We knew such events were possible. If you look at tsunami deposits, you can find them up at these heights from the past. But in terms of general awareness, the scale of this event was not anticipated in the short term. And there were some cases where the warning was given, people were aware that a tsunami was coming, but because they had the seawall, they actually chose not to evacuate. So even though safety in terms of hills were perhaps a 5-minute easy walk away, providing people were mobile, they could reach that safety, there were some cases where people actually chose not to escape because they had been part of building a wall to protect them. Now, that's not to say that that's not a good initiative. That's not to say we shouldn't be building these walls. And that's not to say that the community come together is good. It's fantastic. But it comes back to this education element and understanding what warnings mean. So when you have a warning saying it's going to be larger than a certain height or between a certain height, understanding the uncertainty. And with so much about risk communication, it is about understanding that uncertainty. And how do we make sure that we do trigger safety-seeking behavior? And that can come, again, from the government and what's being told, but it also can come up from community. And there's a lot of work around warnings where people very much look for social reinforcement. It's not just about what they hear officially, it can also be about what their neighbors do or what the local leader, whether a formal or informal leader, does, somebody who they respect and what they do. So in terms of warning, that sort of relationship between individual responsibility and state is really important to understand. And also when we come to reconstruction, in Japan, we looked at things like where after the event, there were temporary housing complexes, so where prefabricated temporary housing was built and people could live there. And there was a lot of lessons learned from previous events in Japan and internationally about moving communities together, making people have that community spirit. They're not suddenly taken out away from their community, away from their support system. Earlier we talked about psychological impacts. Having that community support and your usual mechanisms is so important post-disaster. But within these complexes, people were sort of, moved in these areas. Now, very large private companies could rebuild quite quickly. So, for example, take very large major supermarket chains or department stores. They could build away from town centres. They could build on land away from the coast in protected places. Now, those were built very quickly, and that's great for people in those temporary situations to be able to shop, to be able to buy food, supplies, to have a community centre, to have somewhere people can meet. But it does change people's habits. It changes where is desirable to live and where is less desirable. It changes people's social networks. So then we also saw the cases where, for example, in the high streets of some of the towns most badly affected, local leaders, and as I say, a lot of these were sort of informal leaders, these are just people who took it upon themselves to emerge as leaders, arranged applying for grants, arranged for rebuilding shops, arranged for sort of very small little towns, so that spirit didn't go away, because otherwise, the whole shift occurs, and then that community that had built and was there, it is no longer there. And when we look at what people can do, we have to look at, again, going back to that vulnerability idea of who is able to make those decisions and who is able to build and who isn't. So, for example, when I was in the Philippines and we were looking at people who had been affected by Typhoon Haiyan, there was a no-build zone created 40 meters around the coastline. The government imposed that. And we spoke to many residents who were living in temporary accommodation in that zone. And we asked them, are you aware of the no-build zone? And they said yes. In 99% of cases, they could point to me exactly where that no-build zone was. They were completely aware of it. So it wasn't that they didn't know. And they would just respond, I'm in it. But they didn't have a choice. There wasn't somewhere else they could build. There wasn't the option of that. So we really, again, have to go back to that context. So when you ask the question about sort of self-responsibility, government responsibility, private company, NGOs, we have to make sure that there's a genuine informed choice. So people really understand not just the basic information, but the uncertainty around it. But also, if we are trying to help empower people and give communities or individuals the chance to make decisions for themselves, that they actually have the resources to do that. And they actually have, whether it's finance, resources, or assistance, governance, awareness of legal systems, awareness of grants available, so that they can make those decisions.
Okay, Joanna, thank you very much indeed for those very useful insights. Daiju Takahashi, I'd like to get back to you in Japan. While we're talking about this very important point of collaboration, who's involved in the reconstruction and recovery of a disaster zone, we're hearing about sort of governments, businesses, communities, people. You find yourself in the middle of all of that because you're working hard to revive business and agriculture in the Fukushima area. What kind of collaborations are you seeing in Fukushima, and what do you think are some of the secrets to really successful collaboration in terms of recovery and reconstruction?
Yes, let's take the fishery industry that's been most severely damaged. So Japan's fishery industry was actually, even before the disaster, it was a typical industry on decline. And so producers were decreasing, revenue was decreasing, and fishermen were fast aging. So it was clear that going back to the pre-disaster state wouldn't go anywhere. So those fishermen who started to get back on their feet again and started to fishing, it was clear to them that they have to create new values. And from the consumer's point of view, the supply chain was destroyed. So they switched to the fishery products from other regions. So even if we rebuild the supply chain infrastructure and we got back to the pre-disaster state, from the consumer's point of view, there's no reason to switch back to the fishery products from the Tohoku or Sanriku region that's been devastated. So we really have to come up with new values, new products that are attractive in the commercial market. So,
and how are you doing that then?
Yeah, so we did, and I had no clue what to do, but we tried many things. We matched the fishermen with the buyers. We held an event. I even saw the seaweed on the street in the middle of Tokyo. But during the course of many actions, we started to realize that bringing farmers, fishermen, and consumers together, connecting them directly with consumers, would actually create new values. Consumers find, they have never interacted with fishermen in their life. So interacting with them, fishermen, and knowing them, how they are fishing, where, how, and with what kind of passion and emotion, that was the source of the value, new values created in the industry. So from a couple of years after, we intentionally tried to bring them together, connect food producers with the consumers. That's turned out to be the key success factor.
And this is about building trust and confidence, is it?
Exactly. So it also helped greatly to rebuilding the trust I mentioned. So science is, of course, as Professor Takamura mentioned, is very important, and it's the foundation. But just scientific discussion, scientific communication wasn't actually able to regain consumers' trust. It was actually turned out to be human aspect, people that actually were able to regain consumers' trust directly. Farmers, fishermen directly communicating to consumers in front of them, where and how they are raising this product, these vegetables, fruits, how they are fishing their fish. That eventually overcame this psychological issue and regained the trust.
You say that this is quite unique, though. That hadn't happened before, that sort of close relationship between the consumer and the producer or the fishing crews. How challenging has that been? Because I guess you've had to change some very deep-rooted ways of doing business from the past.
Yes. Traditionally, Japan's agriculture, fishery industries are known or infamous for the long value chain. So it was really unprecedented. And so the industry wouldn't change overnight. The key to bringing change in the industry was actually creating a small yet vivid precedent, success case. It can be small, but if you make a small success and promote that, and then gradually that precedent would lead to the industrial change.
Let's take a look at an example, Daiichi, of something that you're working on in Fukushima. I know that you've been collaborating with a restaurant chef and a farmer there that we're about to see in a clip from a Euronews program that we filmed in Japan recently. Let's take a look at how they're helping to revive agriculture and food consumption. Take a look at this.
Tatsuya Watanabe cooks Fukushima products without fear. On from the harbour, the restaurateur heads to his market gardener to get his daily supplies. The two men are actively involved in the reconstruction of their region, thanks to a precious friendship for the farmer.
Where I think I was lucky was meeting a trusted local chef right after the disaster. He and his chef friends, and I with my network of farmers, were the driving force to create something together, making people want to come back to Fukushima because they ate good food. I think that's the first step towards reconstruction.
Tonight we meet up at Tatsuya Watanabe's restaurant, which he's reopened in Iwaki, his home region, encouraged by loyal customers.
There were many false rumors from the beginning. Friends of friends said there were deformed fish, even though I told them that it wasn't the case. I had tests done and gradually started to serve more local products. If in April there are discharges of treated water, I will continue to use fish from Iwaki.
So Daiichi Takahashi, clearly that partnership in Fukushima is working in terms of the chef and the farmer there. We talk a lot about building the trust amongst the consumer and the confidence of the consumer going forward to consume goods once again from Fukushima. But how much also is it about getting confidence back to the business people themselves, the producers, the chefs, because maybe they thought that maybe they couldn't have a future?
Yes, so I mentioned the connection between food producers and consumers, but thank you very much for showing this video. Chef is also another very critical element. Chef plays a role of maximizing the value of food products, vegetable, fruits, and fish. They are the best transmitter of the values created by farmers and fishermen. And consumers do trust them as the most trusted connoisseur of the food. So chef also played a key role. So from both consumers, actually the food producers and chefs, it's actually, again, I'd like to emphasize the key of human factors there. I mean, chefs wouldn't, explain 100 becquerel per kilogram. They would translate how delicious, why delicious, how the best ingredient that those farmers and fishermen are producing. So that human communication, human element is critical in bringing back consumers' trust.
Professor Takamura, you're a specialist in radiation medicine, and you're also the director of the Great East Japan Earthquake and Nuclear Disaster Memorial Museum in Fukushima. You talked a little bit earlier about the importance of education going forward in terms of the recovery and reconstruction of Fukushima. What do you think of what Daiichi Takahashi was saying there about building confidence? And we heard from the chef in that video clip, didn't we? He was saying that there were false rumors, in his word, about things like deformed fish, for example. How is this confidence going to be restored, and how do you think it can be restored? Just take yourself off of mute, please, Mr. Takamura.
Okay, so thank you very much. So actually, such a building a trust between the each stakeholder is very important for the recovery process after a nuclear disaster. Actually, now I'm working at the local community which affected by the nuclear disaster. And then, as you may know, that it is well known that a certain kind of the radionuclides, so-called radiocesium, is concentrating in the mushroom. It was very well known based on the experience of Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident in 1986. So also at the time of the Fukushima accident, this radionuclide, radiocesium, were released into the environment. But on the other hand, the affected area of Fukushima prefecture was very famous for such a mushroom. So even before the accident, so residents enjoy collecting the mushroom and eat the mushroom. So after during the recovery process, residents return to their hometown, but they are worried whether they can consume the mushroom as previous time. So that's why. So now we and the residents are collaborating a special project, so-called the mushroom map project. And then we asked residents to collect the mushroom, and then we measure the concentration of radiocesium in the mushroom. And then we prepare the kind of the map of the community with the corresponding spot and the concentration of radiocesium in mushroom. And based on this kind of information, we are doing a kind of the communication between residents, experts, and local authorities. And then, of course, as an expert of the radiation medicine, radiation health effect, so minimization of the exposure dose is very important. But only for the minimization of the radiation exposure cannot go forward the recovery process of the community. So that's why we should communicate based on the each background, and then find a way how to go ahead, how to go forward for the recovery of the community with the continuing the good culture of the affected area. This kind of the the communication, careful continuous communication is very important for such a revitalizing of the community under the trust of the each such a resident, experts, and local authorities, I think.
Okay, Professor Takamura, thank you very much indeed for that. Daiichi Takahashi, I'd like to just quickly go back to you for a final point on this important element. I guess that there are very strict controls in place around products that are being produced and consumed from Fukushima. You're obviously focused a lot on the domestic market there and getting agriculture back and also getting people consuming goods again. But how much of this is also about getting exports back up and running of products from Fukushima? I know a lot of countries around the world have now lifted their restrictions on products coming from the area. How important is it that not only the domestic market gets that attention, but also the international one in terms of the wider reconstruction and recovery of Japan in this?
Yep, I think replicating the process in Japan that we regain the consumer trust, I think is a key. We can replicate, meaning, of course, scientific safety is the base, it's a foundation. So we do have the world's most strict standards, and we follow them strictly. So communicating that is very important. But on top of that, I think for international market as well, we need this human factor I've been emphasizing. So I'd like to sell the stories of farmers and fishermen, exactly those videos that you showed. We'd like to promote those human side, more personal side of farmers and fishermen that are actually working on this big challenge. And that would also, I think, be very appealing as well as effective in the international market as well.
Okay, Daiichi Takahashi, thank you very much indeed. Just a reminder to you in our audience, if you're just joining us, if you have any questions for any of the panelists on the screen here today, we're talking about this subject. When disaster strikes, how do you respond and reconstruct? If you have any questions for any of our guests, please do leave them in the chat box just below the video screen where you're watching. And as I said earlier, we'll have 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the session today to ask your questions directly to our guests. So please do get in touch. Mario Flores, I'd like to go back to you at Habitat for Humanity International, joining us from the US today. Let's look more widely now at disasters and the impacts that they can have in different countries. What's your take on building confidence, getting people back into communities, reviving business and the economy? What are some of the key ingredients, do you think, that need to go into that?
Yeah. Well, initially, when a disaster strikes, there is an emphasis on relief at the beginning. It's about saving lives. It's about, making sure that no further damage come to the affected communities. It's about trying to prevent the displacement of significant amount of population. But then after that, there comes a time when you have to start looking at what we call early recovery within the communities. And the best way to do that is to have a people-centered approach, is to focus on the people, on their needs, on what their aspirations are in terms of getting back to normal. So you have to look at different things in the context. It's very contextual, of course. how much support is coming to them from different sources, from the government, from relief agencies, from NGOs such as Habitat for Humanity that usually come to help in the early recovery. And then we need to start coordinating between all the actors. That is a very important function that needs to happen after a disaster. If there is no coordination, then all of these efforts will be disconnected one from each other, and we're going to be wasting a lot of resources, valuable resources. So coordination is really key in the way that we move forward. Now, coordination ideally should come from the government. There is a government entity that should take the lead in coordinating the different actors that are responding, that are coming together, to do recovery, to do reconstruction. And then we are aiming to that reconstruction to be something that leaves a better situation for the people that were affected for the disaster, better markets, better connectivity, better housing, better infrastructure. We don't want to be rebuilding the risk that existed before, but we want to be, building resilience within the communities that were affected, so they can be ready, because in many parts of the world, natural hazards are recurrent hazards. For example, here in the Americas, we have hurricane season every year. Every year we know that we're going to have, this series of storms. Same for Asia Pacific. Same for earthquake-prone areas. We know that these hazards are going to interact, and they're going to have the potential to disrupt, the normal lives of people. So again, it's interesting that in Japan, for example, 4 years after the Fukushima disaster and the earthquake and the tsunami, the United Nations convened all the governments to come to Sendai to actually, make commitments on a global agenda to reduce risk. And that is why we have what is known the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a commitment by national governments to work in their own countries, with their own communities in reducing the elements of risk. And that is very important because as I was mentioning before, yes, we need to respond every time that there is a disaster. We need to find ways, to restore what existed before and to bring people back. But as much as we can prevent, as much as we can mitigate and reduce the risk, it's going to be easier for us when disaster strikes. So it's a matter of coming all together. It's a matter of having good coordination. It's a matter of having the people at the center, so they become actors in their own reconstruction and in their own recovery.
Joanna at University College London, would you go along with that? Because I guess a lot of countries have different experiences of different disasters. Is this about the international community working together, sharing, learning, mitigating the risk going forward? And how much of that do you see right now?
Of course, and we can all learn from each other, but we also have to, again, put things in context. So if we talk about shelter and housing, for example, how well we can rebuild after a disaster is very much based on what was going on before. So if we compare, I'm in the UK, so I'm going to compare the UK and Japan, where we're talking about today. Japan's population is about double the UK, but they produce many times new houses each year to the UK. So that's sort of 3 times per population. So Japan is actually in a very strong position to rebuild because of the style of rebuilding. Having prefabricated houses which are then put on site makes things a lot easier actually in the post-disaster context. Whereas in other countries where the normal housing production is low, to suddenly ramp that up after a disaster would be incredibly challenging. So yes, we can learn from each other and we can adopt practices, but we have to always put this in context of what, as an example, building is for the norm, of what the individual responsibility is for the norm. And we see a lot of comparisons between different countries post-event. So if we look at things like, again, the temporary housing and looking at the cost per unit in the Japan situation in 2011 was something like 25 times that of, for example, in China 2008, L'Aquila in 2009, and many other disasters. So you might think, oh, that was very expensive, but it was also much quicker. A lot of these were done within 6 months or so, which was incredible. The speed was really phenomenal. But as I say, that has to be placed in the context of what the usual production rate is. So international comparisons are incredibly useful, but we can't just do it at face value of, how quickly was it built? How much did it cost? Did it meet these standards? How much area was there per person? It has to be put in that context of what is expected. And I really want to pick up on that point that others have made about individual needs, community needs, and what is that people need. If somebody's elderly, if somebody has a disability, if somebody has children at school, if somebody is younger versus older, they have different needs and they have different priorities. And if we don't recognize those, then that's not a people-centric approach, and we're not doing what we should be doing.
Okay, Joanna, just briefly, because I've got a couple of questions from our audience that I want to get to before we finish. But on this issue of risk mitigation and reduction going forward, we hear a lot of people telling us that the risk of disasters going forward is growing. Some say it's linked to climate change. And in Europe, for example, we're seeing a lot more flooding over recent years, things like forest fires in southern Europe as well, that can be quite devastating. How much of an effort do you think there is going into risk management and reduction generally? Because it doesn't tend to be seen as a sexy thing very often, does it? And people think, well, maybe it'll happen to us, but maybe it won't.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that we also need to make disaster risk reduction a bit more positive. Often when we talk about it, we focus on the negatives. And of course, there's a lot of negative impacts from disasters, without saying. But if we can also look at the positives. So, for example, in Japan, a huge number of people died and every life lost is a tragedy. But if we go back to previous events in the sort of last 100 or 200 years, the percentage of people who were affected within the inundation zone, so where the tsunami struck, fewer people were actually, as a percentage, were affected. And we do need to recognize the efforts which are being done to create that positive change so people can see it. But we need to make disaster risk reduction the center of planning. We can't build a community and then say, oh, how do we make this resilience against a disaster? Because we've already planned it and then it's retrofitting, it's not as good. We need to think of this right from the beginning. And Mario mentioned this right at the beginning about where do we build nuclear power plants? We can't build them and then retrofit it. We need to think of that strategy right from the start. So we need to prioritize disaster risk reduction and make it at the center, not just something at the side, but throughout that process to really make it effective. And as you say, make it a bit more exciting to people, for people to see the need for it right through the beginning. So then it become a bit more, in your words, sexy.
Okay, Joanna, thank you very much indeed for that. Thanks to our audience for sending in questions. We've got a couple here that I'm going to get to. I think this first one will go to Professor Takamura, if you don't mind. This question comes in from Lulu. Thank you very much indeed for your question today. They're asking, what is the general feeling in Japan about the future of nuclear power? Do people remain wary about its use, or do they see the benefits of renewable energy outweighing the risk? What do you think?
Yeah, actually, I'm not the expert of the energy.
I know.
But but anyway, so currently, such kind of the opinion about the future usage of the nuclear power plant is bipolar. So the future discussion is very difficult. But as I mentioned, so we should carefully continue such a discussion for our future sustainable development. So nevertheless, we should find out the best mix for our country, I think.
Okay, Professor Takamura, thank you. And thank you to Lulu for your question. One other question, Mario, I think I'm going to fire this one at you from Habitat for Humanity International. This question is coming in saying, what does the transition look like as humanitarian and aid organizations slowly wean support following a disaster? For example, how does support following the Haiti earthquake differ to that of Japan?
Yeah, exactly. And relief organizations by nature, they come and in the very aftermath of a disaster, and they provide life-saving support. But then there is this continuum, that follows that. I mean, relief organizations are not really geared for reconstruction. Reconstruction it's a more complex proposition. It involves markets. It involves regulations. It involves much higher level of resources. So the way this should work is that there should be a transfer, of the relief phase into the early recovery and the reconstruction phase. Is what we call the continuum. There should be a continuum there, and not being left people behind, which is what usually happens. In the case of Haiti, for example, there were a lot of agencies and NGOs in the country, even before the earthquake. And then when the earthquake took place, and everybody started working in trying to deal with the dire situation, with relief supplies and trying to, build transitional shelters and temporary housing, for everybody who were left just out in the open in camps and all of that. But because of the context, again, because there was no real governance ready to, take or the transfer of those initial stages into a more reconstruction phase, then that's where we had the difficulties of trying. That didn't happen in Japan, for example. In Japan, the government was very strong. The elements of the way the society is organized were able to, take it from the relief phase into the recovery and the reconstruction. And then a few years after the tsunami, the earthquakes and tsunami, you would go to Japan and you wouldn't notice that there was a disaster there.
Okay, Mario, we have to leave it there because we're running out of time, unfortunately.
Okay.
But very important message and very important thing that you're saying there. Just in the final minute that we've got, 10-second answers from each of you. I'm going to challenge you to that, very short answers. For other countries, other people watching this, what's your best words of advice in terms of responding and reconstructing after a disaster? 10 seconds, Joanna.
Have a family plan, know what warnings might come, and evacuate if you can.
Noburu, 10 seconds answer.
Yeah, we should learn the experiences that we experienced before.
Okay, great. That was 5 seconds. Daiju?
Yeah, I think to make the community more resilient, I think we should transcend the borders. Society constrained by the borders are less resilient, so we should always try to consciously transcend psychological borders between industries, between communities, between ages, and all kinds of borders.
Okay, and Mario, finally.
Yeah, be aware of your of the prevalent hazards in your community, and be ready to take action to make your home more resilient and your community more prepared for disasters.
Yeah, and I think an important point that was made throughout this debate today is the importance of collaboration, everybody being involved, not left behind, that close collaboration of governments, people, businesses, communities, all those different organizations that are involved in the reconstruction and recovery after disasters. Thank you very much indeed to our guests. Let's say thank you to them one by one. Daiju Takahashi was joining us from Japan. Thank you very much indeed to you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your contribution. Joanna Walker was joining us from University College London. Thanks to you, Joanna.
Thank you, everyone.
Mario Flores joined us from Habitat for Humanity International in the US. Thank you very much indeed to you, Mario.
You're welcome, and thanks to all.
Thank you. And thanks very much indeed to Noboru Takamura, a professor from the University of Nagasaki in Japan. Thank you very much indeed for your expert insights today. Okay, we couldn't hear you there, but thank you very much indeed for joining us. And thank you very much indeed to all of you in our audience who've been watching this debate for the past 60 minutes or so. Some very insightful words there coming from our experts about the future of disasters, risk management and mitigation, but also how to respond in the best ways to disasters when they happen to limit the impacts of them right around the world. If you joined us halfway through this debate or a little bit in, you can watch the full debate on our website. You can catch it there at euronews.com. But for now, though, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you again soon for another Euronews debate. Goodbye.